We have essentially here, at least in North America, a virtually unending supply of potentially healthy foods. And this is all because of the judicious use of agrochemicals. More than 99% of the pesticides that we consume come from natural sources. They're not chemical additives, because plants over the years have evolved to protect themselves against various insects and various fungi. Coffee is an interesting example. When you sniff your cup of coffee in the morning, you're sniffing about 1,000 different compounds. Among them are things like furfural, caffeic acid, benzene, styrene. That coffee plant did not evolve to please us. It did not evolve so that we can grind up its beans and put it into hot water and enjoy it. It evolved to multiply and to protect itself. What matters is what that substance is, and whether or not that benzene comes from a laboratory or it comes from a natural source doesn't matter. The body handles it exactly the same way. Most people will understand the basic cornerstone of toxicology, that only the dose makes the poison. And that, if you are exposed to a lot of something, you may have a worry. If you're exposed to a trivial amount of it, you probably have no worry. Aspirin is a classic example. I mean, aspirin is a great headache remedy, but you have to know how much to take. If you take an aspirin tablet when you have a headache and you lick it, your headache is not going to go away. If you swallow 2 tablets, the headache will go away. If you swallow a whole bottle of tablets, you will go away. So, it's only the dose that makes the poison. And whether or not something is present at parts per million or parts per billion or parts per trillion makes a very big difference. A part per billion is 1 second in 32 years. So it's a very, very small amount if you think about that. A part per trillion is 1 second in 32,000 years. I mean, this is amazing that we can detect substances down to parts per trillion. And just because we can detect it doesn't mean that it's doing something. The presence of a chemical does not equal to the presence of risk. Unfortunately, this is not the way that most people think. The question that they ask is it there or is it not there? Is it toxic or is it not toxic? Well, those are not the right questions to ask. The question to ask is the amount there relevant in terms of amounts we know to be toxic? And the answer when it comes to any sort of pesticide residues, the answer is no. Yes, they're there because we can detect them. But just because they're detectable doesn't mean that they're doing some sort of harm.
A football field's about an acre, give or take. A football field sort of seems to be the standard measurement that everyone uses. On that acre, we're typically putting between 5 and 10 gallons of water. So that's about 20 to 40 liters of water. So most people, when they see that sprayer passing, they think, oh my goodness, look at all the material coming out of that spray boom and those nozzles, and look at all the mist that's being created. Well, the vast majority of what they see is water. In fact, 99% on average is water that's coming out. We're just using water as a carrier. We use water to distribute the very small, the 1% that is in a tank of crop protection agent to the field. And the actual amount of active ingredient that's present is very small. It's a few cups. It's even a few tablespoons in many cases per football field, per acre. So it's a much smaller amount than most people know.
Most farmers, of course, want to use the minimum amount of pesticides. Why? First of all, because they're expensive. Second, if there's any risk associated with pesticide use, and there is some risk to the applicator. I mean, obviously, pesticides are potentially toxic. So who's at most at risk? Are the farmers. So they try to use as little as possible. And these notions promoted by the activists that farmers are out there uncaringly spraying and drenching, that's the word that they use. This is absolute nonsense. The amount of pesticide that is used these days is very, very little. In some cases, a few grams per acre. And the result of that, of course, has been the fantastic food supply that we had.
There's a certain reliance on the government to do its due diligence. Farmers can't do that due diligence. So we have in place regulatory mechanisms, regulatory agencies like the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the PMRA, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. They have 400 scientists on staff at the PMRA in Ottawa and across Canada that critically evaluate the merit and the scientific evidence of the performance of that product. So they have a very keen interest in protecting Canadians. They have a very keen interest, a mandate, in fact, of protecting air and water for the use of future generations.
We need to scrutinize the pesticide residues. We need to look at production methods, but this is being done. This is why we have regulatory agencies, who are not manned by uncaring people. They're good scientists. They do good work, and their job is really to protect the public, not to undermine public health.
They care, for example, very much about the environmental fate. How quickly does that product degrade in air, water, or soil? What harm can it pose to non-target organisms, and exactly at what doses can that harm occur? Is there any evidence that that active ingredient has any harm whatsoever to bystanders or the consumers that eat it?
These are tested chemicals. In Canada, Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency, and in the US EPA and FDA regulate pesticides. And boy, you have to jump through a lot of regulatory hoops and hurdles in order to get a pesticide registered. And in order to do that, of course, data has to be submitted where they've done animal tests, where they have shown how much you can give to an animal without causing any harm. That's the so-called no observed adverse effect level. Then by convention, that's divided by a dose of 100 to put in an extra safety factor for humans. And that then becomes the acceptable daily intake for humans. So there's a lot of science that goes into that.
In the example of human bystander exposure, the PMRA, for example, uses sophisticated models to determine the exposure of someone to the product. They know the level that is safe, 100% safe for that individual, and then they will impose an additional safety factor. They'll, for example, say, no, we want it to be 100 times less than that to make sure that the vulnerable are also protected. Well, let me give you an example. There might be a herbicide that's applied to a crop. It might be a wheat crop, and they will test the potency of that herbicide on a number of non-target species, including things like lettuce, things that would never grow in a field, things that aren't actually off target either. But lettuce is incredibly susceptible to some of these herbicides. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, it killed lettuce at this dose, so you cannot exceed that dose.
I mean, anyone who avoids eating fruits and vegetables or grains because they're worried about the pesticide residues is doing themselves a disservice. Because we have a wealth of information these days about the benefits of eating fruits and vegetables and grains. It comes down to risk benefits. And the benefits of all the nutritional components of plant foods outweigh any of the risks that may be there because of pesticide residues or anything to do with genetic modification.
The family farm, a tradition in Canada going back 200 years. This canola farm has been in the family for 3 generations. Today's farmers face the same challenges as their forefathers: weather, soil fertility, pests, commodity prices. But today's farm is radically different from the romantic ideal.